The low hum of the police radio was the only thing keeping the stale air in the precinct from feeling entirely dead. Detective Miles Corbin, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of 15 years on the force, was nursing his lukewarm coffee and reviewing cold case files. It was 3:17 a.m. in the sleepy, unremarkable town of Oakhaven, the kind of time when criminals slept and only bad luck stirred. Miles, a detective who believed in logic and procedure above all else, often scoffed at the ghost stories and urban legends that occasionally trickled through the night shift. He'd seen real horror, the kind inflicted by human hands, and found it far more disturbing than any campfire tale. His partner, Officer Lena Petrova, a sharp, ambitious young woman with a reputation for being unfazed, was scrolling through a recent spate of petty theft reports. "Anything interesting, Miles?" Lena's voice was a low murmur, careful not to disturb the sleeping sergeant in the corner. Same old, same old. A missing cat, a few joyriders, and a report from a Mrs. Gable about a gnome stealing her prize-winning petunias. Miles sighed, rubbing his temples. This town is boringly peaceful, thank God. As the words left his mouth, the emergency phone on Lena's desk, the one designated for direct, unrecorded 911 transfers, flashed a blinding, insistent red. Lena snatched it up, her posture instantly snapping to attention. 911, what is your emergency? Miles watched as the color drained from her face. Her eyes, usually so focused, became wide and glossy, fixed on some unseen terror. She held the receiver tight, knuckles white. "Sir. Can you repeat that?" I can't quite make out what you're saying," she stammered, leaning closer to the phone. The voice on the other end was too muffled for Miles to hear, but it sounded like a low, vibrating static, interspersed with something that resembled wet, frantic gasping. Lena gestured wildly at Miles, mouthing, "Get dispatch. Trace this call. Now." Miles scrambled for the main radio, his heart starting a dull, heavy drum in his chest. This wasn't a joke. Lena never looked like this. That he got through to the dispatcher, his voice tight. "Dispatch, we have a priority 1 call on the direct line. Trace it immediately. Officer Petrova is taking the call." Back at the desk, Lena was desperately trying to maintain control. "Sir, I need you to stay calm. Are you injured? Where are you right now?" The voice on the other end finally sharpened, cutting through the noise. It wasn't the frantic gasping anymore. It was a single, high-pitched chuckle, unnervingly close, followed by a sentence that chilled Miles to the bone. Even from across the room, the voice was thin, reedy, and profoundly wrong, like a child's voice played backward and slowed down. "The clock has been reset. You're too late for the prologue, officer. But you can still catch the first act." Then, silence. A deafening, total silence. Lena slowly put the receiver down, her hands shaking so badly she had to brace them on the desk. "Lena, what the hell was that?" Miles demanded, his logical brain struggling to process the impossible dread radiating from his partner. Lena didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead, into the dark window reflection of the empty precinct. He knew my name, Miles. He didn't ask. He just knew. Miles frowned, his procedural instincts kicking in. Did dispatch get a trace? Before Lena could answer, the direct line phone flashed red again. They both froze, staring at the handset. The number was blocked. Miles slowly reached for the phone, his hand hesitating just inches from the plastic. "It's the same caller." Lena grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't answer it. Miles, I have a bad feeling." But the chilling words from the first call, "The clock has been reset," echoed in Miles's mind. This wasn't a standard threat. It felt like an invitation to a game they didn't want to play. He had to know who was behind it. Taking a deep breath, Miles answered the second call. "Detective Corbin. You have the police." The voice on the other end was no longer a distorted whisper. It was a perfectly clear, calm, and utterly familiar sound. It was the voice of a man they had all known, a man who had vanished without a trace 6 months ago, and whose cold case file was currently sitting on Miles's desk. Miles. They're here. They're in the walls. Don't check the basement. Don't look at the eyes. And whatever you do, don't hang up this time. The caller ID screen on the phone flickered, and for a split second, a name appeared, Detective Samuel Rourke. Miles's eyes shot to the cold case file. The photo on the cover stared back, a smiling Detective Samuel Rourke. Missing and presumed dead. Miles dropped the phone, the clatter echoing in the silent station. The line was dead. Who was it? Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. Miles could only stare at the phone. He knew, with an absolute certainty that defied all logic, that the case he had just called boringly peaceful had just cracked wide open, and the thing that emerged was something far more terrifying than a human killer. The hook. Miles and Lena have received 2 impossible 911 calls. The first call referenced a prologue, and the caller knew Lena's name. The second caller identified himself as Detective Samuel Rourke, a missing officer presumed dead, and issued a series of bizarre, fear-inducing warnings. Miles, a man of logic, now holds Rourke's cold case file, and the chilling reality of a supernatural, personalized horror has just invaded his small, quiet precinct. They are now officially part of the first act. Miles felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a heavy, suffocating feeling he hadn't experienced since his rookie days. He picked up the receiver, but the line was dead. He slammed it down, his gaze fixed on Rourke's picture. That wasn't possible, Lena, Miles muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. Rourke is gone. Missing person file 10-44. Vanished 6 months ago without a single trace of foul play or runaway intent. It was a digital anomaly. A spoof. It had to be. Lena, however, was already halfway across the room, talking rapidly into the main radio. Dispatch, I need an immediate, full report on the trace of that direct line call. Where did it ping? I need coordinates now. A moment later, the dispatcher's voice crackled back, laced with confusion. Officer Petrova, we don't have a trace on either of those calls. That's the problem. The system registered the calls, but the source was immediately disconnected and scrubbed clean. Zero data. It's like the signal came from nowhere. Miles and Lena exchanged a look that spoke volumes. The direct 911 line was secure, hardwired, and virtually untraceable only if the signal was rerouted through a complex, illegal satellite network, or, the thought felt ridiculous, even to Miles, if the call was never meant to be traced in the first place. Okay, Miles said, his voice regaining its professional steel, forcing his fear down. Let's treat this like a bad joke gone digital, a high-level harassment. Rourke's family, maybe, still grasping at straws. We follow protocol. Lena, pull up Rourke's last known whereabouts and his case file. Lena was already at the precinct computer, her fingers flying across the keys. Rourke's file popped up, missing since April 14th. Last seen, home, 148, Hawthorne Street. Last contact, 11:30 p.m., called his wife, claimed he was just finishing paperwork. Miles walked over, reading the notes. He told his wife he was just finishing paperwork. That means he was at the station. Wait, Lena said, leaning closer to the screen. Look at the time stamp on the call he made to his wife. 11:30 p.m. But his body camera footage from that night, which was recovered later, shows him signing off at 11:15 p.m. and walking to his car. So he lied, Miles concluded. He didn't want his wife to know he was going somewhere else. Lena scrolled down to the file's final entry, last known location, 148, Hawthorne Street, residence, evidence found, none. Door locked. Wallet and keys on the kitchen counter. His phone was found smashed in the backyard, its data chip missing, final note, case stalled. Subject Rourke remains missing. Miles, look at the address again, Lena pointed, her voice dropping. 148, Hawthorne Street. It's an old, two-story colonial. It has a full basement. And Rourke's call, he specifically told you, don't check the basement. The coincidence was too precise. The caller, claiming to be Rourke, was referencing a detail only the investigating officers knew, a key location in the abandoned investigation. Miles grabbed his coat, the smell of lukewarm coffee suddenly sickening. We're going to Hawthorne Street. Now. This stops being a joke if the prankster is hiding out in Rourke's empty house. But Miles, if it is a high-level prank, they'll be ready for us, Lena cautioned, strapping on her vest. And if it's not, Miles finished, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm, then we need to find out what happened to Sam Rourke before this first act gets a curtain call. As they stepped out of the precinct and into the cool, silent night, a final, crucial detail clicked in Lena's memory. She paused, looking back at the empty, flashing 911 line. Miles, she said softly. The caller, Rourke, he told you not to look at the eyes. Rourke's case file mentions a missing piece of evidence, a small, personalized photo album his wife said he always carried. The only photo she could describe was a picture of him and his daughter where she was wearing a cheap, plastic mask with oversized, vacant eye holes. Miles stopped dead in his tracks. The darkness of Oakhaven suddenly felt vast and menacing. The warning was not random. It was a precise, terrifying instruction. Let's move, Miles urged, his voice tight. And Lena, keep your flashlight beam low. We don't want to draw attention to the house. But as they drove the 3 silent blocks to Hawthorne Street, they saw something that stopped them cold. Rourke's house was dark, silent, and appeared utterly abandoned, exactly as the file stated. But someone, or something, had left a message. Scrawled across the freshly painted white garage door, written in a thick, wet, crimson substance, were 2 words, THEATERISOPE. Nan. Beneath the words, perfectly centered, was a single, large, staring eye. Miles and Lena didn't need to run the chemical analysis to know the crimson substance wasn't paint. Next step, Miles and Lena have arrived at Detective Rourke's abandoned house, finding a terrifying, personalized message written in what appears to be blood. Miles stopped the unmarked cruiser a block away, killed the engine, and cut the headlights. The only illumination came from a solitary, flickering sodium street lamp at the corner, casting the neighborhood in an unhealthy, sulphurous yellow. Stay here and call it in, Lena, Miles ordered, pulling his heavy-duty flashlight from the glove compartment. Tell them exactly what we saw, the writing, and request a silent, unmarked forensic team. Use the code word, the stage is set. No sirens. No lights. Tell them to wait 2 blocks away until we signal. No, Miles, Lena said, her voice firm. She unholstered her sidearm and flipped the safety off. We go in together. This isn't a cleanup, it's a crime scene that looks like a goddamn threat manifesto. And if Rourke's family is inside, or if the man who sounded like him is, we need 2 guns and 2 pairs of eyes. Miles recognized the conviction in her eyes. She was right. He nodded, clipping his flashlight to his belt. Fine. Protocol dictates we approach from the perimeter. I take the north side, you take the south. Look for forced entry. And remember Rourke's warning, don't check the basement, and don't look at the eyes. They moved in tandem, silhouettes gliding from the cover of overgrown hedges to the dark shadows of neighboring houses. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like a held breath. When they reached the house, the crimson writing on the garage door seemed to glow in the ambient street light. THEATERISOPEN. The thick substance had already begun to congeal, its metallic odor unmistakable. Lena approached the garage first, her flashlight beam a narrow white ribbon cutting through the darkness. She knelt, her gloved hand hovering near the sticky residue. It's fresh, Miles. Done within the last hour. And the eye, look at the detail. The eye wasn't childish. It was large, perfectly spherical, and drawn with chilling anatomical accuracy. The pupil was a pinprick, but the iris was composed of intricate, swirling lines that seemed to move in the periphery of their vision. It felt like it was staring directly at their souls, a cold, empty cyclops gaze. Ignore the symbolism. Find a way in, Miles instructed, though he couldn't tear his own gaze away immediately. He headed toward the front porch. The front door was locked, just as the original case file stated. No sign of forced entry. Miles moved to the back, scanning the small, neglected garden. That's where Rourke's phone had been smashed. That he found the rear entrance, the kitchen door, ajar. Just a sliver, but enough to know someone had recently passed through. Back door is unsecured, Miles radioed softly to Lena. Going in. He nudged the door open with the toe of his boot. The house air that drifted out was cold, dry, and smelled overwhelmingly of old paper and ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. They entered the kitchen, flashlights sweeping across the pristine, but eerily empty room. Rourke's wallet and keys were still sitting on the counter, exactly where they had been 6 months ago, covered by a thin layer of dust. "This is wrong, Miles," Lena whispered, her voice barely a breath. "If someone was here recently, doing that, they would have disturbed the dust. This looks exactly like the scene we cleared 6 months ago." Miles nodded, his eyes narrowed. He looked down. There were no footprints in the dust on the floor. None. Except for one dot near the threshold leading to the living room, imprinted clearly in the dust, was a single, deep impression. It wasn't a boot print, or a shoe print. That it was the clear, deep outline of a bare human foot. And in the center of the heel impression, where the softest part of the skin should have been, was a clean, round hole, as if a sharp implement had been twisted into the flesh. "Footprint," Miles said, pointing. "Barefoot. And they're not walking normally." As they stepped over the print, a sound echoed from the silent, upper floor, a low, rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump, like a heavy clock pendulum. Swinging slowly inside a hollow space, Miles raised his gun, his logical brain screaming intruder, while a deeper, colder part whispered impossible. "That sound," Lena breathed, her flashlight wavering slightly. "It's coming from the master bedroom. That's where Rourke's wife said she last heard him on the phone." They moved toward the staircase, taking it slow, their flashlights casting dancing, grotesque shadows on the walls. With every creak of the old wood, the slow, mechanical thump-thump from upstairs seemed to speed up, just infinitesimally. Halfway up the stairs, Miles stopped. His flashlight beam had caught something hanging from the ceiling near the landing. That it was Rourke's missing photo album. It had been opened, and its pages were hanging down like heavy, wet banners, and attached to the album, swinging gently with the rhythm of the mechanical thumping, was a small, ornate brass wind-up key. The key was turning slowly, winding something deep inside the walls. Suddenly, the mechanical thumping stopped, replaced by a noise that made Miles's blood run cold, a scratchy, looping sound coming from the open photo album. It was Rourke's voice, a final, tinny recording. "The clock has been reset. You're too late for the prologue, officer. But you can still catch the first act." It was the first 911 call, played back on a tiny, antique voice box rigged inside the photo album. As the sound faded, the brass key stopped turning, and the album's pages fluttered. Miles and Lena saw the exposed photo, Rourke and his daughter, the girl wearing the cheap mask with the oversized, vacant eye holes, and then, a new sound cut through the silence. Not from the upstairs bedroom, but from right below them. A deep, resonating scrape, followed by a heavy, wet shudder. It was coming from the basement. Next step, Miles and Lena are trapped between the mechanical horror above and the deep shuddering beneath them, having just received a personalized recording of the first 911 call. The heavy, wet sound from the basement floor below them was impossible to ignore. It was a guttural drag, like something immensely heavy being pulled across concrete, followed by a low, rhythmic squelch. Miles's logical training battled fiercely with Rourke's chilling warning, "Don't check the basement." Miles looked at Lena, whose face was a mask of cold determination, her gun still steady. "Protocol, Miles," she whispered, her voice strained. The basement is the only place in this house where someone could hide. The sound is coming from there. It's the point of least resistance. We clear the basement first. It might be the source of the wind-up device, or the person operating it. Miles slowly shook his head, his gaze sweeping the dimly lit landing. No. That's what the caller wanted. It's a classic misdirection. The sound is too loud, too convenient. And Rourke's message wasn't, "Don't check the basement yet." It was, "Don't check the basement, full stop. This is a trap, Lena." He pointed his flashlight toward the master bedroom door, from which the faint scent of ozone still drifted. Whatever the first act is, it's upstairs. That's where Rourke last spoke to his wife. That's where the wind-up key stopped. We follow the crime, not the noise. Lena hesitated, her flashlight beam flickering nervously at the basement door nestled under the stairs. The squelching intensified, punctuated now by a sound like a low, wet sigh. It sounded less like a prankster and more like a monstrous, wounded animal. The basement is unsecured, Miles. The floor is directly beneath us. If whatever that is comes up, then we have the height advantage, Miles countered, his voice low and urgent. Upstairs. Now. They crept past the open photo album, whose pages had now ceased moving. The single picture of Rourke's daughter, smiling with the black, empty eyes of the mask, seemed to follow their ascent. The master bedroom door was closed. Miles pressed his ear against the wood, listening intently. Nothing. No movement, no breathing, not even the mechanical tick of the clockwork that he signaled for Lena to cover him, then gripped the cold brass doorknob. He turned it slowly, wincing as the old mechanism protested with a high-pitched creak that he kicked the door open, his gun raised, Lena immediately sweeping left. The room was clean, immaculate, and utterly empty. The bed was neatly made, a pristine white duvet pulled taut. A wooden dresser sat against the far wall. The air in here was the same as the house, cold and dry. Clear, Lena reported, lowering her weapon slightly. Nothing. Just dust. Miles moved quickly to the closet, throwing the double doors open. Empty. He checked the en-suite bathroom. Empty. If someone was just here to wind up that key, they didn't linger, Miles concluded, frustration tightening his chest. Wait a minute. Look at the bed. Lena walked closer. The pristine white duvet was unmarked, but Miles pointed at the two pillowcases. On Rourke's side, the pillow was perfectly flat and smooth. On his wife's side, however, the pillow had a slight, discernible dent, as if someone had laid their head there just a few moments ago, and resting neatly in the center of the dent, was a single, tiny artifact, a small, antique theater ticket stub. Miles carefully picked it up with a gloved hand. The paper was dry, brittle, and felt incredibly old. Engraved on the back in a curling, italicized script were two words, "First Act." Suddenly, the floorboards beneath their feet gave a sharp, violent shudder, as if a large creature had impacted the wall directly beneath the room. The force of the impact shook the dresser against the far wall. A ceramic jewelry box on top of the dresser rattled, then fell to the floor, shattering into dozens of pieces. Lena swore and trained her light on the shattered box. Miles looked at the wall where the dresser had stood. The drywall was intact, but there was a section directly behind the now broken box that was strangely discolored, darker, wetter, almost spongy. Miles pressed his hand against it. The drywall gave way with a sickening ease. Behind the fragile sheetrock, the plaster was gone. There was only a gaping, black cavity that seemed to drink the light. Miles shined his flashlight into the hole. It was a narrow, vertical void running the length of the wall, an empty space between the exterior and interior load-bearing beams. The air that rushed out of the void was hot, humid, and carried a pungent, metallic smell much stronger than the blood on the garage door. "Miles, what is that?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Miles looked closer. The cavity was lined with something dark and slick. And along the edges of the wooden beams, there were dozens of tiny, almost invisible seams where the dark lining was stitched to the wood, and then, a tiny, bright detail at the very bottom of the void caught his attention. It was a metal name tag. Miles reached in, scraping his fingers on the slick lining. He pulled out the small piece of metal. It was a police badge, oxidized and stained crimson. Engraved on it was the name, Detective Samuel Rourke, and right as he read the name, the sickening sound of something struggling to move, wet, scraping, and impossibly large, came not from the basement, but directly from inside the wall void. A pair of thick, pale fingers, unnaturally long and covered in the dark, slick substance, shot out from the hole and gripped the edge of the opening. The fingers had no nails, but the tips were sharpened, ending in hard, ivory points. The creature inside the wall pulled itself forward, and Miles and Lena scrambled back, guns pointed at the horrifying, gaping hole. A low, familiar voice, wet and strained, echoed from the void, "Miles, the eyes, don't look at the eyes." Miles and Lena reacted instantly. Miles shoved Lena behind the protection of the thick wooden bed frame as he shouted, "Gun! Drop your weapon!" He leveled his Sig Sauer at the growing horror in the wall. The thing was still trying to worm its way out. The slick, dark fingers clawed desperately at the plaster edge of the hole. The skin was unnaturally pale and translucent, with veins like blue wires visible beneath the surface. It was coated in the pungent, metallic crimson substance that lined the cavity. "Miles, the eyes!" Lena hissed, gripping her weapon but avoiding looking directly into the hole. Rourke's wet, strained voice was still echoing from the void, but now it sounded like a gagging sob. "They're coming, for the performance, for the closing act." The creature managed to pull its forearm free. It wasn't human. The joint at the elbow bent backward, and the entire limb was grotesquely elongated, almost twice the length of a normal man's arm. Miles didn't hesitate. This wasn't a man, it was an active threat, a monstrous perversion of life. He fired a single round, aiming for the center mass of the emerging arm. Blam! The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The projectile impacted the pale flesh with a wet thud. The creature didn't cry out. It didn't bleed. The bullet simply stopped, lodging in the thick, rubbery substance of the arm without penetrating. A small plume of dark, metallic smoke erupted from the entry wound, and the flesh instantly sealed itself, the bullet disappearing beneath the skin like a lost marble. Miles stared, his logical worldview collapsing around him. Incapacitate. He fired 2 more shots, aiming for the creature's hand, trying to make it let go of the wall. The rounds had the same effect: thud, smoke, seal. The creature's grip did not falter. Now, its head began to squeeze through the opening. It was long and narrow, covered in the same slick, pale skin. It had no hair, no nose, just a wide, stretched mouth that emitted the guttural, choking sound of Rourke's voice. But what truly froze Miles and Lena were the eyes. The eyes were huge, vacant orbs that dominated the face. They weren't made of flesh or water, they were perfectly round, smooth, and made of a hard, polished brass. They were fixed and unblinking, like the lenses of a surveillance camera, reflecting the twin beams of their flashlights in a horrifying, cold glare. The instant Miles's eyes locked with the brass gaze, a blinding wave of fear and disorientation hit him. It wasn't just panic, it was a cascade of images, memories of Rourke's terrified face, the image of his own wife weeping, and the sound of the wind-up key turning, echoing inside his skull. He squeezed his eyes shut, dropping his gun hand slightly, fighting the overwhelming urge to check the basement, to run, to scream. "Don't look, Miles. Remember the warning." Lena shouted, her voice cutting through the psychological assault. She hadn't looked at the eyes. She was aiming her light at the floor, shooting around the creature's massive chest, trying to blind or confuse it. The creature used Miles's momentary lapse. It lunged, pulling its upper torso free of the wall, and fixed its brass eyes on Lena. Lena let out a short, sharp gasp as the same wave of mental terror struck her. She staggered back, bumping against the bedpost, her gun waving wildly. Miles, recovering fractionally, noticed one detail: the creature's long, thin neck was exposed as it lunged. It was covered in the same black, stitched seams that lined the cavity. Thinking fast, Miles hurled his heavy-duty flashlight like a javelin. It struck the brass neck with a sharp, metallic clang. The creature roared, a sound that was pure electronic distortion, a burst of white noise that made their ears ring. It retracted its head violently, pulling its long neck back into the safety of the dark void. The brass eyes disappeared. Screch, a horrible, scraping sound came from inside the wall cavity, as if metal teeth were raking across bone. The fingers retracted. The hole was suddenly empty, save for the dark, glistening, blood-like lining. Miles and Lena stood panting, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The master bedroom was silent again, the only sign of the attack being the splintered drywall and the reeking smell of ozone and copper. "Miles, what the hell is that?" Lena whispered, finally lowering her weapon. "A distraction," Miles gasped, his mind clear again, the cold brass eyes burned into his memory. "It wasn't trying to attack us, Lena. Not seriously. It was trying to get us to look. To implant something. The eyes, they weren't eyes. They were a delivery mechanism." He looked at the hole, then down at the theater ticket stub in his hand. First act. Suddenly, the floor beneath their feet began to shudder again, but this time it wasn't a violent impact. It was a rhythmic, rising pressure, like a massive hydraulic lift beneath the house. The sound from the basement intensified, not the squelch anymore, but a wet, tearing sound, followed by the grating noise of rock grinding against concrete. Miles looked down, spotting a sliver of light emerging from the floorboards near the dresser. The boards were slowly beginning to separate under the immense upward pressure. "It's not a distraction anymore," Miles said, grabbing Lena's arm. "It's coming up. The basement is collapsing in reverse. We need to get out of this house now." As they ran for the door, the familiar, thin, reedy chuckle from the first 911 call echoed from the upstairs hallway, loud and clear, seemingly emanating from the very air around them. "Bravo! The actors are leaving the stage. But the exit is just the beginning of the interlude." And then, the light in the master bedroom abruptly failed. They were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The sudden, absolute darkness in the master bedroom was thick and suffocating. The air, heavy with the metallic tang of the thing in the wall, pressed in on Miles and Lena. The rhythmic thump of the rising floorboards became frantic, accompanied by the horrible screech of splintering wood. Miles grabbed Lena's wrist, pulling her toward the doorway. "Run! Don't look back!" They crashed through the door and stumbled onto the landing. The high, reedy chuckle of the unseen operator of the first act was now coming from everywhere at once, a disembodied echo that seemed to taunt them from the air ducts and the shadows. "The staircase!" Miles yelled, aiming his light at the ground, remembering the instruction not to look at the eyes. As they reached the first step, the floor of the landing above the master bedroom, the very spot they had just stood, buckled with a wet, ripping sound. A massive, pale, brass-eyed head burst through the ceiling, covered in dark, fibrous matter that trailed like monstrous hair. It was looking down the staircase at them. The creature's voice, amplified by the cavernous rupture in the ceiling, boomed, a chilling mix of Rourke's strained words and electronic static. "Curtain call. Don't leave your seats. The show is not over." They scrambled down the stairs, jumping the last 3 steps as the entire second floor groaned, its weight shifting heavily. They landed hard on the main floor. The light in the hallway flickered back to life, then settled into a sickly, pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, illuminating the single barefoot print in the dust. The moment they were off the stairs, the basement door under the staircase, Rourke's forbidden space, flew open with a sound like a gunshot. A wave of stifling, hot air, thick with the smell of iron and decay, rushed out. A new sound emerged from the gaping, black void of the basement, a slow, measured, and familiar siren whine, but horribly distorted, slowed down, and layered with the sound of deep, heavy breathing. The siren. Lena breathed, her face pale. "It sounds like a broken police car radio." Miles grabbed the doorknob of the rear exit, wrenching it open. "It's the bait. We take the distraction. We run." They burst out the back door and sprinted across the dead lawn toward the perimeter. As they reached the hedge line, Miles glanced back at the house. Every single window on the first and second floors was now glowing with the same sickly, pulsing light. In the upper-story master bedroom, the creature's brass eyes were pressed against the jagged hole in the wall, watching them, and on the front door, the crimson message on the garage, THEATERISOPEN, was slowly, visibly beginning to drip down the white paint, the blood-like substance sizzling slightly as it hit the asphalt driveway. They reached the unmarked cruiser a block away, throwing themselves inside. Miles fumbled the key into the ignition, hands shaking violently, and slammed the accelerator. "We need to get the forensic team there now," Lena gasped, still struggling to catch her breath. Miles checked his watch. 3:55 a.m. Less than 40 minutes since the first call. No. The threat level changed. We pull the forensics back, and we don't go back there without a full hazmat and tactical team. This thing isn't human. It's biological, mechanical, and knows our playbook. He radioed the waiting unit 2 blocks away. Code word change. Cancel, the stage is set. New status, full containment. No approach. Hold your position. We're returning to the station for evidence processing. As they drove away from Hawthorne Street, the silence in the car was heavy, broken only by their ragged breathing. Miles felt the weight of the brass badge in his pocket, Rourke's badge, coated in the metallic substance. They pulled up to the Oakhaven precinct minutes later. The place was deserted save for the dozing sergeant. Miles and Lena quickly gathered the evidence: the bloodied badge, the antique theater ticket stub, first act, and the fragmented memory of the creature's brass eyes. Miles laid the items on his desk. "We run Rourke's badge through forensics for DNA and the substance. We run the ticket stub for prints. We call the chief." Lena cut him off, her eyes fixed on the evidence desk. "Miles, look at the ticket stub again." Miles leaned closer. The stub was old, but intact. The writing on the back said first act. He flipped it over. The front of the ticket stub was printed with a date, venue, and showtime. Venue, Oakhaven Municipal Theater, currently abandoned and condemned. Showtime, 4:00 a.m. Date, today's date. Miles looked at his watch. 3:58 a.m. 2 minutes, then, he looked up at the empty bulletin board on the wall, where the officers posted local events. Someone had pinned a new flyer to the board, a flyer that hadn't been there when they left. The flyer was a garishly colored, old-fashioned advertisement for a theatrical show. The title, printed in bold, Gothic font, read, "The INTRLUDE," and the subtitle was a single, chilling instruction: check the tape. Lena immediately ran to the old magnetic tape 911 recording system, the system that recorded every standard 911 call. She pulled the main spool and found the end of the night's recording, then hit playback. The tape spun, filling the quiet precinct with the static and low hum of the last few hours. They listened through the expected calls: Mrs. Gable's petunia complaint, the missing cat report, and then, the familiar, thin, reedy chuckle of the unseen entity. But it wasn't the call they had received on the direct, unrecorded line. This was a new recording, played back on the main system, from a call they never took. A child's voice, clear and cold, came over the speaker. "I told Detective Rourke the same thing. Don't look at the eyes. And don't check the basement. But you always listen to the wrong voice, Detective Corbin. You missed the prologue, you survived the first act. Now, for the interlude, I want you to look up my address." Then, the static faded, and a voice, calm, professional, and familiar, spoke the address: 140 Hawthorne Street. Miles's eyes snapped to Lena. 148, Hawthorne Street was Rourke's house. 140, Hawthorne Street was the empty house next door. The recorded voice on the tape was that of their sleeping sergeant, Sergeant Wallace. Miles and Lena stared at the empty, flashing screen of the 911 recording system. The voice of Sergeant Wallace, their Sergeant Wallace, currently asleep in the corner, had just given them an address: 140, Hawthorne Street, the house next door to Rourke's. The time on the ticket stub, 4 a.m., was now ticking down, indicating the interlude was about to begin. Miles's mind raced, struggling to reconcile the evidence. That was Wallace's voice. Perfect modulation. But it was definitely the entity's message. It's not just physical, Lena. It's learned our vocal signatures. It's using our trust against us. Lena's gaze was fixed on the sleeping form of Sergeant Wallace, a man who had been nothing but a stable, predictable fixture in their professional lives. She gripped her sidearm tighter. The flyer said, "Check the tape." "The tape told us to look up the address," Lena said, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "It's building a path." And it used the sergeant's voice because it knew we would trust the source of command. Miles approached the sergeant cautiously. Wallace was slumped over his desk, snoring softly, a half-eaten donut resting beside his hand. Miles gently nudged his shoulder. Wallace jolted awake, blinking sleepily. What's going on?" "Everything all right, Miles." His voice was thick with sleep, slow, and completely different from the crisp, calculated command voice on the tape. "Sergeant," Miles said, his voice level. "Have you received any calls, or talked to anyone in the last half hour?" Wallace rubbed his eyes. "Calls? Nah. Been right here. Just, catching a few Z's." "Why? You two look like you've seen a ghost. You finally find that missing gnome?" He chuckled, a familiar, harmless sound Miles knew then. The sergeant was clean. The entity had merely cloned his voice, using the recorded 911 system as a terrifying, personalized jukebox. "We have to go to 140 Hawthorne," Miles decided, grabbing his keys. "It's a countdown, Lena. The interlude starts at 4 a.m. It's 3:59. We need to cut off the next act before it starts." "But Miles, the thing in Rourke's house is still active, and we have no backup," Lena protested, strapping on her vest. "The entity wants us at 140. We follow the trap, but we anticipate the release," Miles said grimly. "We're not going in blind. We know what to look for, brass eyes and stitched seams. And we're going in with a piece of its theater." He snatched the antique theater ticket stub, the first act ticket, from the desk and jammed it into his pocket, treating it like a specialized piece of evidence, a psychological bomb the entity was using to map its sequence of terror. They were back in the car and speeding toward Hawthorne Street within seconds. "The file on 140 Hawthorne," Miles instructed Lena as he drove. "Give me everything. Owner, occupancy, anything." Lena quickly pulled up the property records on her phone. 140, Hawthorne Street. Owned by the Oakhaven Historical Society. Vacant for 12 years. Listed as a historical site due to its unique plumbing and construction. No electricity. No gas. Nothing but the shell. No power, no people, Miles mused. Good. No hostages, and no cameras. They parked the cruiser even further away this time, plunging into the dark, silent street minutes later. The sulphurous yellow light from the street lamp seemed even weaker now that as they approached Rourke's house, 148, they saw that the crimson writing on the garage was no longer dripping. The blood-like substance had dried into a thick, scab-like texture. The giant eye, now a dull, dead crimson. 140 Hawthorne Street stood immediately next door. It was a mirror image of Rourke's house in size and style, an old colonial, but while Rourke's house was manicured but empty, 140 was wild, overgrown, and truly derelict. The porch sagged, the windows were boarded up with rough plywood. Miles checked his watch. 4 a.m. The interlude had begun. From inside 140 Hawthorne, a faint, rhythmic sound began to pulse. It was low, deep, and sounded exactly like the thump-thump they'd heard upstairs in Rourke's house, but magnified, as if the entire structure was the mechanism. They reached the front door of 140. It was not locked, but nailed shut with several rusty iron spikes driven deep into the frame. "This is the opening of the show," Miles said, pulling a crowbar from his belt. "We break the seal." He wrenched the crowbar under the first spike and pulled. The rusty metal screamed in protest as it tore free of the wood. The rhythmic thump-thump inside the house sped up slightly, like a heart quickening with adrenaline. As Miles pried the final spike, Lena suddenly grabbed his arm and pointed to the ground. Strewn across the overgrown grass directly beneath the porch were dozens of small, scattered objects. They were antique, brittle theater ticket stubs, hundreds of them, littering the yard like spent shells. Lena picked one up, her fingers trembling. This ticket was completely blank on the front. On the back, it was only embossed with a single word. Prologue. Miles looked from the prologue ticket in Lena's hand to the first act ticket in his pocket. He understood now. The entity was meticulously documenting its terrifying theatrical run, leaving a paper trail of its crimes. They pushed the door inward, and the smell that rushed out was not decay, but clean, freezing water and chlorine. The house was not derelict inside. It was entirely gutted. The walls were gone, the floorboards had been stripped, and the ceiling was open to the rafters. The light from their flashlights revealed only two things in the massive, three-story void: a winding, antique spiral staircase made of wrought iron, descending into the absolute blackness where the basement should be. A single, immense structure covering the entire ground floor, centered under the gaping roof. It was a massive, empty swimming pool, tiled in a pale, sterile white, and filled to the brim with water that looked unnaturally clear and still. And floating in the center of the perfectly still water, face down, was a single, motionless body, wearing the blue uniform of the Oakhaven Police Department. It was Sergeant Wallace. Miles and Lena stood frozen in the doorway of 140 Hawthorne. The rhythmic thump-thump from the skeletal structure pulsed around them, a heavy, omnipresent heartbeat. The overpowering smell of chlorine and cold, still water filled the vast, gutted space. The sight of Sergeant Wallace floating face down in the massive indoor pool was a brutal shock, a direct violation of their last hour of frantic activity. The killer had been in their precinct, taken Wallace, and staged him here, all while they were confronting the creature next door. Wallace. Lena whispered, her voice cracking with grief and rage. Miles pushed his emotions aside, his detective training overriding the horror. We don't know if he's dead. We need to get him out. Lena, cover me. Watch the staircase and the rafters. That thing can move in the walls. He ran to the edge of the pool, a slick, white, tiled perimeter. The water was crystalline, reflecting the skeletal wood of the roof like a perfect mirror. He knelt, reaching out for the sergeant's uniform. As his hands skimmed the water, the rhythmic thump-thump stopped abruptly. The silence was absolute, heavier than the noise. Miles hesitated, looking into the unnaturally clear water. It was deep. Too deep for a basement excavation. This pool was a purposeful, monumental structure, the centerpiece of the interlude. He leaned closer to Wallace. The sergeant's head was submerged, but his hand floated near the surface. Something was clasped tightly in his fist. Miles plunged his hand into the freezing water, grappling with the body. He managed to pry open Wallace's rigid fingers and pull the object out. It was a small, white, waterlogged piece of cardstock. It wasn't a ticket stub. It was a perfectly square theater program. The ink was running, but the title was still legible. The INTRLUD, and printed beneath the title, where the cast list should be, was a list of names, arranged in order: Detective Samuel Rourke, Sergeant John Wallace, Officer Lena Petrova, Detective Miles Corbin. They were the next two names on the killer's program. They were the stars of the show. Miles. Lena screamed, her voice echoing wildly in the open space. She wasn't looking at the pool, she was staring up at the spiraling iron staircase that descended into the darkness. A sound had begun on the wrought iron stairs, the slow, metallic squeak of a heavy object being dragged down the steps. Miles spun around, his gun trained on the staircase. The figure emerging from the darkness wasn't the brass-eyed creature from the wall. It was a man, dressed in a faded, filthy suit, his face obscured by shadow. He was dragging a large, wooden trunk down the steps, the heavy thud of the trunk causing the entire iron structure to vibrate and ring. The man reached the bottom of the stairs, stopping just at the edge of the massive pool. He dropped the trunk with a final, echoing crack. Miles shouted a challenge. Police. Put your hands up. Drop the trunk. The figure slowly raised his head. He was thin, gaunt, and his skin was covered in a network of fine, metallic scratches, like the etching on an old clock face. His eyes were wide and frantic, bloodshot and terrified. He was not the entity, but a victim, broken and exhausted. "It's Sam Rourke," Miles breathed, recognition flooding him. The missing detective, Rourke didn't look at them. He only stared straight at the pool, his terror focused solely on the water. "It's not him, not really," Rourke croaked, his voice strained and unfamiliar. "It's the mechanism. I heard the voice, the laughing, it told me the next part. I had to drag it here. It's the only way to stop the next show." He pointed a trembling finger at the large wooden trunk. "It's the heart. It's the Clockwork Man." The voice said, "You have to look through the keyhole." Miles and Lena approached the trunk cautiously, weapons still raised. It was a large, antique steamer trunk, locked with a heavy brass clasp. In the center of the clasp was a small, ornate keyhole. "Don't do it, Miles," Lena warned, her light steady on Rourke. "The brass eyes, it told you not to look at the eyes. A keyhole is an eye." Miles remembered the psychological paralysis from the brass eyes. But Rourke's message had always been a sequence of terrifying, literal instructions that he slowly knelt, placing his eye close to the cold brass keyhole. The inside was absolute, perfect darkness. As he looked through, a sudden, bright light flared up from within the trunk, searing his retina. He cried out, reeling back, covering his eyes that he didn't see an image. He didn't hear a sound. But a single, clear, devastating fact was instantly and violently imprinted onto his mind: the thing in the wall at 148 Hawthorne was not Rourke. It was Rourke's skin, stitched into a puppet and piloted by a mechanical intelligence. The thing floating in the pool was Sergeant Wallace. And the Clockwork Man in the trunk was waiting for a key, the brass wind-up key hanging from the album at 148 Hawthorne, to begin its final, terrifying sequence. Miles dropped to his knees, gasping, his eyes burning. Rourke, seeing Miles had completed the instruction, let out a terrible, rattling scream of finality. He did not run. He simply walked to the edge of the pool and stepped in, sinking quickly into the clear, deep water. As Rourke's head went under, a new, louder sound began to emanate from the trunk, the high-pitched, thin chuckle of the killer. The interlude is complete. The stage is set for the final act. Miles opened his eyes, the burning subsiding just enough for him to see. He looked at the massive, empty pool, the body of Wallace, and the spot where Rourke had just sunk, and then he looked at the wooden trunk. The brass keyhole was now glowing with the sickly, pulsing yellow light they had seen in Rourke's house. The light was coming from inside the trunk, and protruding from the keyhole, slowly extending outward, was a long, thin, pale finger, tipped with an ivory point. Next step, Miles and Lena are faced with the revelation that Rourke is the latest sacrifice, and the final mechanical entity is emerging from the trunk, awaiting the brass key from Rourke's house. Miles scrambled backward, pulling Lena with him, their eyes locked on the terrifying brass keyhole. The pale, ivory-tipped finger protruding from the trunk twitched, probing the air like an insect's antenna. The chilling, high-pitched laughter echoed from within the solid wood. "The Clockwork Man," Miles muttered, the horrific knowledge he'd gleaned through the keyhole still burning in his mind. "It's mechanical, Lena. The creature next door was just a flesh puppet. This is the source. The heart." He looked at Rourke's rapidly disappearing body in the clear, chlorine-filled water. Rourke hadn't been trying to save himself, he was completing his part of the twisted interlude, fulfilling the entity's instructions. "It needs the key," Lena realized, her voice tight with adrenaline. The brass wind-up key on the photo album at 148 Hawthorne. That's what it was waiting for. It can't start the final act without winding itself up. Miles pulled out Rourke's bloodied badge, his mind racing. "It wants us to bring it here. It's a test of compliance. But we're not playing its game anymore. We have to beat its schedule." He looked at the empty, spiraling wrought iron staircase that led to the darkness above and the final act below. "The Clockwork Man is contained in that trunk for now. It's waiting for its cue. We have maybe 5 minutes before it finds another way out." Then we go back, Lena decided, shouldering her weapon. We get the key and we don't bring it back here. We take the mechanism out of the equation. As they rushed out of 140 Hawthorne, the stench of chlorine and the rhythmic, silent pulse of the massive house seemed to follow them. They sprinted back to 148 Hawthorne, the prologue house, its windows still glowing with the sickly yellow light. The front door, which they had left ajar, was now sealed shut with a thick, newly formed layer of dark, fibrous material, the same matter that had lined the creature's cavity in the wall. It sealed the entrance, Miles said, his frustration mounting. It knows we're coming back for the key. They moved to the rear door, which was also sealed. There was no way in but through a window. Miles found a loose board on the rear porch and managed to pry open a ground floor window, the glass shattering silently onto the dusty kitchen floor. They climbed inside, flashlights sweeping the space. The kitchen was exactly as they left it, except for one crucial difference. The single, barefoot print in the dust was now covered by a thin, flowing trail of the dark, fibrous material, weaving like a vine toward the stairs. The creature's puppet is still moving, Miles said, gripping his gun tightly. It's protecting the key. They crept toward the staircase. The winding vine of dark matter led straight up to the landing where the photo album was hanging. As they ascended, the rhythmic thump-thump was back, coming from the master bedroom. But this time, it wasn't the sound of an internal clock. It was the sound of something large and heavy dragging itself across the floor toward the hole in the wall. They reached the landing. Rourke's photo album still hung there, its pages open to the picture of the girl in the mask. The brass wind-up key was still attached to the binding, gleaming faintly in their flashlight beams, but guarding the album was a horrifying sight. The brass-eyed puppet, Rourke's former body, had dragged itself out of the hole in the master bedroom wall. It was lying half-sprawled across the landing, its pale skin glistening with the dark, slick fluid. Its body was horribly distended and covered in the same black, stitched seams they had seen on its neck. It was no longer using Rourke's voice, but emitting a sound like two wet rocks grinding together. It slowly raised one of its impossibly long, pale arms toward the key, its brass eyes fixing on the album. I'll draw its attention, you grab the key. Miles ordered. Miles shouted, firing a single round into the wall beside the creature's head. The sudden noise of the gunshot startled the creature. It slowly turned its giant, blank brass eyes toward Miles. The wave of psychological terror hit Miles again, a sudden, dizzying montage of all the worst things he'd ever seen on the job. He stumbled, catching himself on the banister, but this time, Lena was ready. She sprinted past Miles, avoiding the creature's direct gaze, and reached the photo album. She seized the key, tearing it free from the brittle pages. Screch, the creature roared, the sound now pure, electronic static that vibrated through the floorboards. It lunged, its long, pale fingers shooting out toward Lena. Lena dodged, retreating to Miles's position. The creature's sharpened fingertips tore through the air where she had been standing, then slammed into the banister with enough force to splinter the thick wood. We have it! Lena yelled, holding up the brass key. As they turned to flee, the creature used its other arm to grab the photo album and flung it into the air. The pages fluttered open, revealing the single, disturbing photo of the girl in the mask. The creature's brass eyes fixed on the photograph, and for the first time, its body seized up, stiffening into a rigid, painful-looking pose. The grinding sound stopped. Miles realized the horrific truth. The entity was forcing the puppet to look at the photo, the very thing Rourke had warned them against. It was a final, internal torture for the residual consciousness inside the skin suit. Taking advantage of the momentary pause, Miles and Lena bolted down the stairs and out the shattered rear window. They sped back toward 140 Hawthorne, the key safe in Lena's hand. The final piece of the interlude was complete. The Clockwork Man was waiting. We don't know what happens when this thing gets wound up, Lena said, holding the key away from her body. We can't take it near that trunk. Miles gripped the wheel, a cold resolve settling over him. Then we don't. We take the key to the deepest place we can find and we destroy it. If the key is the power source, we disable the core. The Clockwork Man can't kill us if it can't wind up its final act. But as they drove past the abandoned Oakhaven Municipal Theater, the very venue printed on the ticket stub, Miles looked into the dark, ornate lobby window, and there, sitting in the absolute darkness, was a small, pale figure, its head cocked to the side, wearing a suit and smiling. The figure was holding a small, old-fashioned megaphone. As they sped past, the thin, reedy chuckle of the killer, impossibly loud and clear, blasted from the theater, instantly silencing the sounds of the night. Wrong choice, Detective Corbin. The show is always about the key. You didn't secure the entrance. You just brought the power to the finale. Next step, Miles and Lena have successfully retrieved the brass key, but the entity is waiting for them at the abandoned Oakhaven Municipal Theater, suggesting their attempt to destroy the key is part of its final plan. The sudden, amplified laughter and the chilling warning from the abandoned Oakhaven Municipal Theater, the very location printed on the ticket, slammed Miles and Lena with the terrifying realization that they were running directly into the final, inescapable stage. Miles slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt a block past the ornate, darkened theater. "It was waiting for us," Lena gasped, clutching the brass key tightly. "It knew we'd panic and try to destroy the key, and it knew we'd drive past this venue." Miles looked back at the theater. The lights were out, the front doors sealed. But the entity's voice, loud, clear, and projected, had been unmistakable. It had left the interlude house, 140 Hawthorne, and set up its final stage here. "We follow the map, Lena," Miles said, his eyes hard. "It wants the key, but it's playing a psychological game. If we try to run, it will just find us, or more likely, it will find Sergeant Wallace's family and start a new prologue. We end it here, now." Miles pulled out his radio, his voice a low monotone. "Dispatch, disregard all previous codes. We are at the Oakhaven Municipal Theater. I need a full tactical cordon. Containment only. No entry. Repeat, no entry. This is a highly specialized, non-human threat. If you see any mechanical devices, any pale figures, or any brass, you hold fire and observe. Send the team to the perimeter, silent approach." He didn't wait for a response. He looked at Lena. "The clock is ticking. This finale is starting. We go in and we secure the key. It's either a trap to lure us in, or the only place we can end this." They approached the theater on foot, weapons drawn. The building was huge, Gothic, and decaying, its grand architecture suggesting a stage for something momentous. The main entrance was bolted from the outside with heavy chains. "It chained us out, but it talked to us from inside," Lena noted, pointing her light at a service door around the side. "It's controlling the flow of the audience." The service door was unlocked. Miles pushed it open, and they stepped into the stifling, dusty air of the backstage area. The space was a maze of dark velvet curtains, coiled ropes, and props covered in drop cloths. The ambient light was provided by dozens of small, antique footlights placed around the floor, all glowing with the same sickly, pulsing yellow they had seen at Rourke's house. The air smelled of ozone, old wood, and a new, distinct scent, perfume, cloyingly sweet and feminine. Miles and Lena moved through the narrow corridors, heading toward the main stage. The rhythmic thump-thump was back, but here it was muffled, coming from the floor beneath them. The stage itself was the next basement. They reached the edge of the wings. Miles peered around the heavy velvet curtain. The main theater was enormous and completely empty. Thousands of velvet seats stretched out into the darkness. The pulsing yellow lights illuminated the grand, central stage, and on the stage, the entity had set up its scene. Center stage was the large, dark steamer trunk from 140 Hawthorne. It was open now. Resting beside it was the small, pale figure they had seen in the window, a mannequin wearing a faded tuxedo, holding a megaphone. The Clockwork Man was no longer inside the trunk. Standing in front of the open trunk was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and dressed entirely in a voluminous, shimmering black opera cape. Its skin was a matte, chalky white, and its limbs were unnaturally jointed, moving with a series of mechanical jerks. Its face was a smooth, porcelain white mask, with a wide, painted, smiling mouth and two perfectly round, vacant eyes. The entity had traded the frightening reality of the brass eyes for the terrifying simplicity of the mask. "Welcome, detectives," the figure said, its voice a synthesized blend of the reedy chuckle, Sergeant Wallace's authority, and Rourke's desperate fear. "Welcome to the finale. I am the director, and you, Detective Corbin, hold the key to the final score." The director pointed a long, bony, white finger, tipped with the same ivory point, at Miles. Its movement was too quick, too sharp. "You brought the key to the theater, detective. You played your part perfectly. The only choice left is where you wind the key." The director gestured with its free hand. On the stage floor, equidistant from the open trunk, were two items, a large, antique music box, ornate, fragile, and covered in a fine layer of dust. A massive, exposed electrical generator, humming quietly, its entire chassis covered in a dark, fibrous material from Rourke's house. "The music box," the director explained, its voice a theatrical projection. "Wind the key in the music box, and the performance ends forever. You destroy my instrument, and I cease to exist. You save the town." Then, the director paused, its head tilting slowly. "Or," it continued, gesturing toward the generator, "you wind the key in the generator. This is the power core of the theater. If you do that, you save the clockwork man in the trunk, the man who will tell you what happened to the children." Miles and Lena exchanged a look of utter bewilderment. "The children?" Miles suddenly remembered the missing persons reports he'd dismissed earlier that night, a spate of mysterious disappearances of teenagers over the last 6 months, always on a Thursday night. The same night Rourke vanished. "It's a liar, Miles. It's trying to manipulate you," Lena yelled. "The music box is the end. The generator is the trap." Miles looked at the director. The entity was not moving, just waiting, its white mask fixed in that cold, unsettling smile. The air grew heavy with the sweet perfume, and the rhythmic thump-thump from the stage floor intensified. Miles looked at the open trunk, now empty. He looked at the two choices, safety or the agonizing, impossible promise of truth about the missing children. Next step, Miles and Lena have confronted the Clockwork Man's director, puppet, which has offered them two final choices: destroy the entity by winding the key in the music box, or save the Clockwork Man, who promises the truth about the missing children, by winding the key in the power core. The silence that followed the director's ultimatum was absolute, save for the low, ominous hum of the massive generator and the desperate, heavy beat of the thump-thump from beneath the stage. Miles knew this was the ultimate trap, the promise of truth against the certainty of safety. "It's a false choice, Miles," Lena hissed, her voice barely audible over the hum. "It's the final act. It's programmed to offer hope to ensure maximum anguish. The generator is where it powers up its killing machine. The music box has to be the mechanism of destruction." Miles, however, was fixated on the names. Rourke, Wallace, and the vanished children. The names Rourke, Wallace, and now their own, were all listed on the playbill. But the children were the hidden subplot, the real prologue that started Rourke's descent. Rourke lied to his wife and went somewhere else. Rourke was investigating the missing children. Miles looked at the director, his eyes narrowed. "Why the children? Why offer that information?" The director's voice was smooth, theatrical, and devoid of genuine emotion. "The children are the audience, detective. They never left. They are merely waiting for the curtain call. The Clockwork Man knows their final seats. The music box destroys the entire theater, including the audience." Miles's mind made a horrific leap. If the director was telling the truth, even a twisted version of it, the children weren't dead, but trapped, preserved somewhere in this vast, mechanical structure. Destroying the music box would destroy them, too. The music box is a kill switch for everything, Miles realized aloud, his voice strained. The generator is the power core. If we destroy the core, the machine stops. If we save the clockwork man, we get the location of the children. Lena was shaking her head violently. No, Miles. It's a trick. The clockwork man is the director. It will power up and kill us. Miles looked at the two objects. The antique music box was beautiful and fragile. The generator was a humming, sweating behemoth, covered in the creature's dark, rubbery fluid. I need to know about the children, Lena, Miles said, his decision solidifying, born out of a detective's absolute need for closure. Rourke gave up his life for this. Wallace died for this. I won't let their sacrifice be for a simple mechanism. I need to know why. He gripped the brass key from Lena, the cold metal heavy in his palm. He walked slowly toward the stage, his gun still raised. The director puppet stood motionless, its painted smile fixed. The air around the generator crackled faintly. Miles reached the edge of the stage. He ignored the fragile music box. He walked toward the massive, humming generator. Lena screamed his name, a word of pure desperation, but Miles didn't falter. He reached the generator, its fibrous coating slick and warm beneath his gloves that he found the designated spot, a small, circular indentation on the side of the chassis, perfectly sized for the key. It was a winding hole. Miles knelt, his eyes locked on the director, watching for any sign of movement, any trick. The director remained perfectly still. Miles pushed the brass key into the winding hole. It slid in smoothly, locking into place with a definitive, metallic click that he turned the key, slowly. Once, the thump-thump from beneath the stage stopped dead. The director puppet collapsed instantly, falling to the stage floor in a heap of fabric and broken porcelain. The pulsing yellow lights around the theater went out, plunging the entire venue into absolute darkness. The sickening smell of sweet perfume vanished. Miles stood in the pitch black, his heart pounding. Lena? Are you okay? Miles? What happened? Lena's voice was a panicked whisper from the wings. The director, it's gone silent. The silence was the deepest, darkest quiet Miles had ever known. He had succeeded. He had stopped the director, but the clockwork man had not emerged. Miles fumbled for his flashlight, turning it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the stage. The director puppet was a heap of junk. The open trunk lay empty. The music box was intact. The generator was silent, and then, he heard the sound. Not a mechanical thump, not a synthetic voice. A low, slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip coming from the center of the stage. Miles slowly aimed his flashlight toward the empty, open trunk. The light beam illuminated the interior of the trunk. It was no longer empty. It was filled to the brim with a clear, stagnant water, and floating in the water, face up, his eyes open and clear, was Detective Samuel Rourke. Rourke was not the withered victim they saw at 140 Hawthorne. He was whole, clean, and terrifyingly serene. "Welcome to the finale, Miles," Rourke said, his voice the exact, calm tone from the second 911 call. "You chose the truth. Good. You chose the clockwork man." As Miles watched in horrified disbelief, Rourke, the man they assumed was the puppet or the victim, slowly began to sit up in the water-filled trunk. "The key wasn't for the generator, Miles," Rourke explained, standing up from the trunk, water streaming off his uniform. "It was for the theater. The generator was just the actuator. You just turned on the lights." As Rourke spoke, the entire theater roared to life. Not with yellow light, but with a brilliant, blinding white light. Every single light in the vast auditorium, from the footlights to the chandelier, flared simultaneously, and in the blinding white light, Miles and Lena could finally see the horrifying truth of the stage. The floor of the stage, the source of the thump-thump, was entirely constructed of the same smooth, brass metal as the creature's eyes. It was a giant, shimmering, brass clock face. The seats of the auditorium were not empty. Every single seat, in every row, was occupied by a figure, small, silent, pale figures, all wearing the same expressionless mask as the director puppet. the audience of the Clockwork Man's finale was the missing children and Detective Samuel Rourke, the serene man standing in the center of the brass clock face, his uniform soaked in water, was not the victim or the puppet that he was the director. Miles felt a seismic shift in reality. The man standing on the brass clock face stage was Sam Rourke, their former colleague, now the serene, terrifying director. The winding key was not for destruction, but for illumination and activation. "Rourke," Miles managed, his voice a ragged whisper. "What have you done?" Rourke smiled, a calm, chilling expression that lacked any human warmth. Water streamed from his hair and uniform, evaporating instantly as it touched the polished brass floor. "I finished the script, Miles. The Clockwork Man is a metaphor. It's the theater itself." "The old Oakhaven Municipal Theater," Rourke explained, gesturing grandly at the vast auditorium. "A perfect, closed system of wood, metal, and memory. It simply needed the right key, your logic, Miles, to wind its final mechanism." Miles looked around. The hundreds of pale, silent figures, the missing children, sat motionless in the seats, their heads all turned in unnerving synchronicity, watching the stage. The sweet, cloying perfume was back, overwhelming the chlorine. "The children," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "They're still alive." "They are the eternal audience," Rourke corrected gently. "Their final performance is permanent. They never left the theater. They were simply placed in their seats during the prologue 6 months ago. The 911 calls. They were the ticket sales." Miles finally understood the true nature of the horror. Rourke hadn't been replaced by a monster, he had become the monster, a devoted curator of this terrifying, mechanical performance. "The creature in the wall, the voice on the tape, that was you," Miles accused, raising his gun. "Those were just instruments," Rourke said, dismissing them with a wave of his hand. The brass-eyed skin suit at 148 was a dummy, sustained by the organic lining of the wall cavity, the Clockwork Man's tissue. "I was merely running the controls from the trunk at 140, preparing the final stage here." Rourke looked down at the brass floor, running his foot across the shimmering metal. "Now, the lights are on. The audience is here. The finale can begin." He looked directly at Lena and Miles, his smile widening. "Your role, detectives, is the encore. You saved the Clockwork Man by choosing the generator, and now, the Clockwork Man saves you, to join the audience." As Rourke finished speaking, the massive brass clock face beneath him began to move. The lines etched into the metal weren't decorative, they were seams. The entire stage began to split open, the sections retracting with a deafening, metallic screech. Miles and Lena watched in horror as the stage floor peeled away, revealing a churning, deep black shaft directly beneath the theater. The shaft was lined with exposed gears, pistons, and enormous, brass-coated clock hands that sliced through the darkness. The whole mechanism was the true Clockwork Man, a massive, subterranean engine. The thump-thump was back, louder than ever. It was the sound of the gears turning. Rourke stood on the only remaining piece of the brass stage, now a small circular pedestal, directly over the churning void. "This is the last curtain call," Rourke announced, holding his arms wide. "Join the performance, detectives." From the rows of seats, the hundreds of masked figures, the children, all stood up in chilling, precise unison. Their bodies moved mechanically, their arms raising slowly toward the stage. The sweet perfume intensified, now a noxious, chemical vapor. "Miles, we have to destroy the key," Lena yelled, pulling out her sidearm and aiming for the key still embedded in the generator, but before she could fire, Rourke looked toward the generator and simply willed the key to turn. The brass key, still stuck in the winding hole, began to spin rapidly, driven by an unseen internal force. The generator roared to life, not with power, but with a sudden, violent explosion of force. The metal chassis fractured, and a blast of superheated air and steam shot through the wings, engulfing the area where Lena was standing. Lena cried out, thrown back against the wall, her gun clattering uselessly to the floor. Miles, shielded by a stack of old props, raised his weapon at Rourke, the only true target. It ends now, Rourke. Miles fired. 2 rapid shots, aimed at the center of Rourke's chest. Blam. Blam, the bullets hit. Rourke didn't flinch. He looked down at the entry wounds. The dark, fibrous material that coated the generator instantly began to seep from Rourke's chest, rapidly sealing the bullet holes. Rourke wasn't just directing the theater, he was physically integrated with its mechanism. "You can't kill the director when the lights are on, Miles," Rourke said, a final note of cold pity in his voice. "You have played your role, but the final act demands a standing ovation." The 2 large brass hands of the underground clockwork mechanism swung upward from the pit, rising toward the stage. They were the size of small cars, their edges honed and sharp. They were reaching for Miles and Lena. Miles scrambled toward Lena, grabbing her and shielding her body. "Miles, the audience." Lena whispered, pointing to the seats. Miles looked up. The hundreds of masked children were all smiling now. The painted mouths on their masks seemed to stretch and widen in the blinding white light, and then, the high, reedy chuckle of the killer, the one they had heard in the first 911 call, reverberated from all around them, no longer a recording, but a collective, synchronized sound from the hundreds of silent throats. Miles and Lena were crushed against the wall as the 2 massive brass clock hands swung past them, a blur of metal and force. The last thing Miles heard, before the metallic shriek and the deafening applause of the children, was Rourke's calm voice, delivering the final line of the script. "Thank you for attending the Whispering 9/11 tapes. The theater is now closed." Fade to black.